Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. A door closes, and for the first time in hours, silence settles. The weight of another's presence has lifted, leaving behind a space that is neither lonely nor empty, only still. It is a moment of quiet reclamation, a return to something almost forgotten. This is solitude, and yet in a world that equates love with togetherness, it is often mistaken for absence. Love is a presence, but it is also a kind of disappearance. When two people step into each other's orbits, something shifts, routines intertwine, silences are filled, the once familiar solitude of selfhood becomes a shared existence. And for all its beauty, love is rarely a seamless merging. It is a constant negotiation between closeness and space. Two lovers can be utterly devoted to one another, and still, in the quiet moments between conversation, feel the flickering ache of something lost, the tranquility of solitude. Rainer Maria Rilke understood this paradox well when he wrote that love is not about dissolving into another, but about two solitudes protecting and greeting each other. Love, when it is deep and true, does not erase individuality, it preserves it. Yet modern relationships often struggle with this balance. The world tells us that to love fully is to merge completely, to sacrifice solitude in the name of devotion. But in doing so, something essential fades. The quiet internal landscapes that once defined us begin to shrink. The thoughts once left to wander in uninterrupted solitude now move through the filter of another's presence. The lovers who miss solitude are not missing each other, they are missing themselves. And yet, solitude is often framed as loneliness, as an absence rather than a presence of its own. The fear of being alone, deeply embedded in our psychology, drives people toward connection at any cost. John Bowlby's attachment theory explains how early relationships shape our tolerance for solitude. Those with secure attachments can embrace solitude without distress, while those with anxious attachments may experience it as abandonment. Carl Jung's concept of individuation speaks to this further. The process of becoming a fully realized individual is not one of constant connection, but one of stepping away, of integrating solitude into the self. But solitude within love is often misunderstood. When one partner seeks time alone, the other may interpret it as distance, as an unspoken dissatisfaction. In truth, the need for solitude is rarely about rejection, it is about self-preservation. It is about maintaining the quiet spaces where one's own thoughts can unfold without interruption, where identity is not shaped by another, but is allowed to exist independently. In the healthiest relationships, solitude is not something to be feared, but something to be honored. This tension is reflected not only in psychology, but in culture itself. In That's Entertainment by The Jam, the mundane repetition of daily life is laid bare, the dull cycle of work, social obligations, and mindless distractions. The song critiques the societal pressure to fill every space with noise, to avoid solitude at all costs. It is a reminder that even in love, even in companionship, the absence of solitude can feel suffocating. Perhaps the question is not whether love and solitude can coexist, but whether we have the courage to allow them to. Whether we can unlearn the belief that love must be all-encompassing to be real. Whether we can trust that distance does not diminish intimacy, but strengthens it. For the lovers who miss the tranquility of solitude, the answer is not to let go of love, nor to let go of themselves. It is to create a space where both can exist, not in opposition, but in harmony. It is to love with open hands, to cherish without consuming, to understand that the truest love is the one that allows us to remain fully ourselves, even as we stand side by side. Yet this balance is rarely taught, rarely modelled. The world idealises love as an all-encompassing force, something that should fill every silence, every space, every moment. But what happens when love becomes so vast that it leaves no room for solitude? What happens when the self, once distinct and whole, begins to blur into the presence of another? Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, argued that love can easily slip into possession, that the act of loving often carries with it the desire to control, to be the centre of the other's universe. He saw in love a quiet danger, a creeping erasure of autonomy, as if to truly be loved meant to be consumed by another's gaze. And yet, true love, the kind that endures, is not one that seeks ownership, but one that allows both individuals to remain fully themselves. Simone de Beauvoir, in The Second Sex, expands on this further. She warns against the cultural conditioning that teaches women, in particular, to disappear into relationships, shape themselves around their partners, rather than standing as separate, autonomous beings. This loss of solitude does not happen all at once. It is subtle, gradual. The space once held for quiet reflection is now filled with conversation, the long walks alone replaced by the expectation of togetherness. There is beauty in this merging, yes, but also a kind of erosion. The moments of solitude that once brought clarity, that once provided refuge, become scarce, and yet the mind still longs for them. Carl Jung's theory of individuation speaks directly to this. Individuation is the process of becoming whole, of integrating all aspects of the self, not just the parts that exist in relationships, but the parts that exist in solitude, in deep internal dialogue. Without solitude, individuation is incomplete. Without time alone, without the space to retreat and reflect, a person risks losing not just their solitude, but their sense of self. And so love must make space for solitude, not as an afterthought, not as something taken only when needed, but as an integral part of connection itself. The strongest relationships are those that do not require disappearance, that do not demand two people collapse into one. Instead, they honor the quiet need for space, for time apart, for solitude, not as loneliness, but as self-returning. This is where culture often misleads us. We are told that needing space is a sign of weakness, of dissatisfaction, of impending separation. But what if the opposite is true? What if solitude is what makes love stronger, what allows people to remain whole within it? In a world that fears silence, the greatest act of love may be allowing each other the quiet necessary to hear ourselves again. To navigate love without losing oneself requires an understanding of solitude, not as separation, but as sustenance. The healthiest love is not one that demands constant proximity, but one that trusts in the ability to return. In a culture that equates love with total surrender, this idea is often misunderstood. We are conditioned to believe that distance weakens intimacy, that true devotion means never wanting to be apart. And yet, the strongest relationships are those in which both people remain intact, where love is an addition rather than a replacement for a fully formed self. Martin Heidegger, in Baying in Time, speaks of the concept of authenticity, the idea that a person must confront their own existence fully without relying on external validation to define their being. This means embracing solitude, not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a fundamental part of what it means to exist. Love, when it is real, does not interrupt this process. It does not replace solitude, nor does it fear it. Instead, it allows it to exist alongside connection, recognizing that both are necessary for a person to remain whole. But love, when misunderstood, can become suffocating. When one partner begins to crave space, the other may feel it as a fracture, as an unraveling of something once whole. And so the natural need for solitude is often suppressed, dismissed as selfishness, as emotional distance rather than what it truly is, an essential part of maintaining a fully realized self. In the absence of solitude, love can become a quiet form of self-abandonment. Erich Fromm, in The Art of Loving, argues that love should not be about possession, but about freedom. He warns against the idea that love should consume, that it should erase all boundaries between two people. Instead, he sees love as an act of giving while maintaining independence. To love another, truly, is not to demand their constant presence, but to allow them the space to continue being who they are outside of the relationship. This understanding of love is rare. The world teaches us that solitude is loneliness, that needing time alone means something is missing. But solitude is not an absence, it is an internal presence, a space in which we reconnect with our own thoughts, our own sense of self. Without it, love becomes something fragile, something that depends on constant reassurance rather than quiet trust. Western individualism and Eastern collectivism offer two contrasting perspectives, one prioritizing personal freedom, the other emphasizing relational interdependence. Yet both struggle with the same fundamental question: can solitude exist within love, or must it always be sacrificed in its name? Alain de Botton, in Essays in Love, explores this tension through the lens of modern romance. He observes how relationships often begin with an illusion that love will complete what is missing, that another person will fill the spaces we have not yet learned to sit with. But the deepest love does not complete, it expands. It does not erase solitude, but makes space for it. And yet the world tells us otherwise. It tells us that needing space is dangerous, that love should be seamless, effortless, uninterrupted. We are conditioned to believe that to love someone is to want to be with them always, that time apart is a warning sign, a slow unraveling. But the truth is, love that cannot withstand solitude is not love. It is dependency. And dependency, though often mistaken for devotion, is a fragile foundation. Perhaps this is why so many relationships, for all their warmth, carry within them a quiet grief. The grief of selfhood slowly dissolving, the grief of solitude lost, the grief of looking across the table at someone deeply loved and yet feeling in some unspoken way that something has gone missing. Not them, not love, but the part of oneself that once existed freely, unobserved. But this loss is not inevitable. Love does not have to consume to be real. It does not have to fill every silence to be meaningful. The strongest love is the one that allows both people to remain whole, to step away without fear, to return, not because they must, but because they choose to. It is a love that trusts in distance, that understands space, not as absence, but as necessary breathing room. To love well is to know that solitude is not a rejection, it is a return. It is the quiet act of reclaiming oneself, of remembering that even in love, one is still an individual, still a mind that needs room to wander. And when love honours this, when it does not demand disappearance but welcomes the ebb and flow of solitude, then it becomes something rare, something enduring. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. To learn more about the subjects covered today, check out the links in the show notes. Until next time.